Brad Mercer had spent years reading about Chernobyl. Countless books, documentaries, survivor interviews, and old photographs had filled his shelves and occupied his thoughts. Yet none of them could satisfy the strange curiosity that had followed him since childhood. The disaster felt less like a historical event and more like a wound left open in time. On a gray autumn morning, he finally arrived in Ukraine to see the place for himself. The journey began before sunrise. A small bus carried a group of visitors through endless stretches of forest and abandoned countryside. Most passengers spoke quietly among themselves, but Brad remained silent, watching the scenery through the window. The closer they came to the exclusion zone, the more the world seemed to change. Villages became sparse. Roads appeared emptier. Nature dominated everything. The guide explained the safety rules, radiation limits, and restricted areas. Brad listened carefully, but his attention drifted toward the landscape outside. He imagined the thousands of people who had once lived normal lives here before April 26, 1986. Children had gone to school. Workers had traveled to factories. Families had gathered around dinner tables. Then, within hours, everything changed. The bus eventually stopped at the first checkpoint. Armed guards inspected passports while a cold wind swept across the road. Beyond the barrier stood the famous sign marking the entrance to the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Brad stepped out and felt an unexpected chill. It was not fear. It was the realization that he was entering a place where history had frozen. After passing through security, the group continued deeper into the zone. The forest seemed endless. Trees lined both sides of the road like silent witnesses. The guide pointed out abandoned villages hidden among the vegetation. Some houses were barely visible beneath vines and branches. Others had collapsed entirely. Nature had reclaimed nearly everything. Brad was surprised by the beauty of the landscape. He had expected something lifeless and ruined. Yet the forests appeared vibrant and healthy. Birds flew overhead. Deer tracks crossed muddy paths. The guide explained that wildlife had flourished since humans left the area. Without cities, factories, or traffic, animals had returned in remarkable numbers. The irony was impossible to ignore. Humanity had abandoned the land, and nature had filled the void. As the bus moved forward, Brad noticed an old school building in the distance. Broken windows reflected pale sunlight. Empty classrooms sat behind crumbling walls. He imagined students rushing through those hallways decades earlier, unaware that they were living their final ordinary day. The thought lingered in his mind. Every structure they passed seemed trapped between past and present. Nothing had been preserved as a museum. Instead, everything had simply been left behind. Around noon, the bus approached the city of Chernobyl itself. Unlike the ghost town Brad expected, a small number of workers still lived and operated there. Utility crews, scientists, security personnel, and maintenance teams continued their duties inside the zone. The city felt strangely normal and surreal at the same time. Some buildings remained occupied while others stood empty. Life existed here, but only in fragments. Brad stepped onto a quiet street and looked around. The silence felt different from any silence he had ever experienced. It was not peaceful. It carried weight. Every empty building seemed to contain invisible memories. Every rusted doorway hinted at stories interrupted decades ago. As clouds drifted across the sky, Brad realized that his journey had only begun. The true heart of the disaster lay farther ahead, beyond the forests and checkpoints, waiting in the abandoned city of Pripyat. Tomorrow did not matter here. Time itself felt broken. And somewhere beyond the trees, the ghosts of history were waiting for him. The following morning, Brad boarded a smaller vehicle that would take the group to Pripyat. Although the city lay only a few kilometers from the reactor, it felt infinitely distant from the world he knew. The road wound through dense forest before emerging beside a faded sign bearing the city's name. Rust covered the metal letters. Weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement. Beyond the entrance stretched streets that had once housed nearly 50,000 people. Brad stepped out of the vehicle and immediately felt the weight of the silence. No engines. No conversations. No footsteps except those of the visitors. The city stood motionless beneath a pale sky. Apartment buildings rose above the trees like forgotten monuments. Their windows stared outward like empty eyes. The guide led the group along a broad avenue once filled with buses, bicycles, and pedestrians. Now grass grew through the asphalt. Branches extended across sidewalks. Nature seemed determined to erase every sign of human presence. Brad walked slowly, absorbing every detail. He imagined families carrying groceries. Children racing home from school. Couples meeting after work. The ordinary moments of daily life felt more tragic than the disaster itself because they had vanished so suddenly. The guide explained how Pripyat had been founded in 1970 to house workers from the nuclear power plant. It had been a modern city, one of the most desirable places to live in the Soviet Union. Residents enjoyed parks, sports facilities, schools, theaters, and cultural centers. The average age of the population had been only 26 years. It was a city full of youth and optimism. Brad struggled to reconcile that image with the decaying landscape around him. They entered an apartment building whose entrance hall was covered in dust and fallen plaster. The stairwell echoed with every step. Brad climbed several floors and entered an abandoned apartment. Furniture had long since disappeared, but traces of life remained. A faded wallpaper pattern clung to the walls. A child's drawing rested beneath a broken window. Fragments of dishes lay scattered across the floor. Brad crouched beside the drawing. The paper had yellowed with age, yet simple shapes and bright colors were still visible. Someone had created it shortly before the evacuation. Someone who was probably now middle-aged or elderly. The realization made the room feel intensely personal. This was not merely history. It was the interrupted story of a human life. Back outside, the group continued toward the city's cultural center. Trees emerged from cracks in the concrete plaza. The building itself stood weathered but recognizable. Inside, collapsed ceilings revealed dark rooms filled with debris. Brad wandered through an old auditorium where rows of seats faced an empty stage. Dust floated through beams of sunlight. He imagined performances, speeches, celebrations, and school events that had once brought people together here. The city seemed haunted not by spirits but by absence. Every location reminded visitors of what was no longer there. In the afternoon they reached the famous amusement park. Brad had seen photographs countless times, yet standing before the Ferris wheel felt entirely different. The yellow structure towered above the surrounding trees. Rust coated every surface. Motionless passenger cars hung suspended in the air. The amusement park was scheduled to open only days after the disaster. Many residents never had the chance to enjoy it. Brad stood beneath the Ferris wheel and looked upward. The wind produced a faint metallic creak. For a moment he imagined hearing distant laughter carried across time. The image vanished as quickly as it appeared. Nearby stood abandoned bumper cars. Leaves covered the ground. Trees grew where crowds once gathered. Nature had transformed the park into something both beautiful and unsettling. As evening approached, long shadows stretched across the city. Brad turned for one final look at the Ferris wheel. The setting sun illuminated the rusted metal, creating an almost golden glow. The sight was strangely beautiful. Yet beneath that beauty lay a terrible truth. This city had not died slowly. It had been abandoned in a matter of hours. Its residents left believing they would return within days. Most never came back. As the group prepared to leave, Brad felt a growing sense of unease. He had seen the empty city. He had walked its silent streets. But the source of everything still waited ahead. Tomorrow he would stand beside reactor number 4, the place where the disaster began, and where some of the darkest moments in human history had unfolded. The next morning arrived beneath a blanket of low gray clouds. Brad woke before dawn, unable to sleep. Images from Pripyat lingered in his mind. Empty apartments. Silent classrooms. The rusting Ferris wheel. Yet all of those places were consequences. Today he would finally see the cause. After breakfast, the group boarded a vehicle and began the short journey toward the nuclear power plant. The road passed through dense forest before suddenly opening onto a vast industrial landscape. Massive concrete structures emerged from the mist. Towers, pipes, and steel frameworks stretched across the horizon. Even from a distance, the facility seemed enormous. Brad felt his pulse quicken. He had spent years studying photographs of this place, but photographs failed to capture its scale. The plant looked less like a building and more like a city constructed entirely from machinery. As they approached, the guide began describing the events of April 26, 1986. During a late-night safety test, a series of critical mistakes combined with design flaws inside reactor number 4. What followed was a catastrophic power surge. Within seconds, explosions ripped through the reactor building. The roof was destroyed. Massive quantities of radioactive material were released into the atmosphere. Firefighters rushed to the scene without understanding the danger they faced. Many received fatal doses of radiation before sunrise. Brad listened quietly. He already knew the facts, yet hearing them while approaching the actual location gave them new weight. History felt tangible here. The vehicle stopped at a designated observation area. In front of them stood the new safe confinement, the enormous steel structure built to contain the remains of reactor number 4. Its curved shape dominated the landscape. The arch was so large that entire buildings could fit beneath it. Brad stepped outside and stared at the colossal structure. Beneath that steel shell rested the destroyed reactor itself. Hidden from view, yet still present. The guide explained that the original concrete sarcophagus built after the disaster had gradually deteriorated. Engineers from many nations later collaborated to construct the massive confinement structure that now covered the site. The project had taken years and cost billions of dollars. Its purpose was to prevent further contamination and allow future dismantling operations. Brad appreciated the engineering achievement, but his attention remained fixed on what lay beneath. Somewhere inside that enormous enclosure rested the shattered core that had changed countless lives. They moved to another viewpoint closer to the reactor complex. Radiation monitors remained within safe limits, yet signs everywhere reminded visitors that this was not an ordinary place. Brad looked toward the reactor building and tried to imagine the night of the explosion. He pictured flames shooting into the darkness. Emergency vehicles racing toward the plant. Workers struggling to understand what had happened. The scale of the chaos was difficult to comprehend. Then something unexpected happened. An older man approached the group. He wore a worker's uniform and carried identification badges clipped to his jacket. Through a translator, the guide explained that the man had worked at the plant for many years after the disaster during cleanup and maintenance operations. He occasionally spoke with visitors. Brad listened carefully as the man described entering contaminated areas, performing inspections, and witnessing the immense effort required to stabilize the site. His voice remained calm and measured. There was no drama in his words. Only experience. Yet that calmness somehow made his story more powerful. He spoke of colleagues who dedicated decades of their lives to managing the consequences of the accident. He spoke of responsibility. He spoke of memory. Before leaving, the man pointed toward the reactor and said something in Ukrainian. The translator paused before speaking. He says that machines can fail, systems can fail, but people must never forget. The sentence lingered in Brad's mind long after the conversation ended. Later, the group visited a memorial dedicated to plant workers and emergency responders. Names were engraved in stone. Photographs showed faces frozen in time. Brad walked slowly among the displays. Many of the individuals honored there had acted with extraordinary courage while knowing little about the invisible danger surrounding them. Their efforts helped prevent an even greater catastrophe. Standing before the memorial, Brad felt a profound sense of respect. These were not abstract historical figures. They had been ordinary people forced into extraordinary circumstances. As evening approached, clouds began to break apart. Sunlight illuminated portions of the steel arch. The massive structure reflected gold and silver against the darkening sky. Brad took one final look at reactor number 4 before returning to the vehicle. The sight filled him with conflicting emotions. Awe at human engineering. Sorrow for the lives affected. Admiration for those who responded. And beneath it all, a growing awareness that the disaster was far more than a technical failure. It was a human story. A story of sacrifice, mistakes, courage, and loss. Tomorrow he would learn more about those who faced the catastrophe directly. The men whose actions in the hours after the explosion helped save millions from an even greater disaster. The morning air carried a sharp chill as Brad left the small lodging facility inside the exclusion zone. The previous day's visit to reactor number 4 had left him restless. He had seen the place where the disaster began, but he had not yet fully understood the human cost of those first terrible hours. Today the guide promised to focus on the people who responded immediately after the explosion. As the group gathered near the vehicle, Brad noticed that the atmosphere among the visitors had changed. The excitement of exploration had faded. In its place was a quiet seriousness. Everyone seemed aware that they were no longer simply touring abandoned buildings. They were walking through the aftermath of a tragedy that had touched countless lives. Their first stop was a memorial dedicated to the firefighters who arrived at the reactor during the night of April 26, 1986. The monument stood in a peaceful area surrounded by trees. Birds sang in the distance. Sunlight filtered through the branches. The setting felt almost too calm for the story it represented. The guide explained how firefighters from nearby stations had responded within minutes of the explosion. Most believed they were fighting a conventional industrial fire. They climbed onto rooftops, handled burning debris, and worked near the exposed reactor core without understanding the extreme radiation surrounding them. Brad studied the photographs displayed near the memorial. Young faces stared back at him. Some appeared barely older than college students. They had arrived expecting a difficult night of work. Instead, they entered one of the most dangerous environments in modern history. The guide described symptoms that began appearing only hours later. Severe nausea. Weakness. Skin injuries. Many responders initially believed they were simply exhausted. Few understood what radiation exposure could do to the human body. Medical personnel struggled to diagnose and treat conditions they rarely encountered. Brad listened carefully while staring at the names engraved in stone. Behind every name existed a family, a circle of friends, a lifetime of memories. The disaster often appeared in books as statistics and technical data. Standing here transformed those numbers into people. Later the group visited an exhibition containing personal accounts from survivors and witnesses. Brad spent nearly an hour reading translated testimonies. One firefighter described seeing glowing fragments scattered around the reactor complex. Another recalled climbing onto a roof while strange metallic tastes filled his mouth. Several workers spoke of confusion, uncertainty, and disbelief. No one fully understood the scale of the accident during those first hours. As Brad moved from display to display, one story captured his attention. It belonged to a young plant employee who had remained at his station despite worsening conditions. The man continued monitoring systems and assisting colleagues while radiation levels increased around him. His actions helped maintain critical information during a period of chaos. Brad found himself imagining the fear those workers must have felt. The explosion had shattered normal reality. Procedures failed. Instruments gave impossible readings. Rumors spread rapidly. Yet many individuals continued performing their duties because someone had to. The exhibition also included accounts from residents of Pripyat. One woman remembered standing on a balcony during the night and watching an unusual glow above the reactor. Another described children playing outside the next morning while invisible radioactive particles drifted through the air. The evacuation order did not arrive until many hours later. Reading those stories filled Brad with a sense of helplessness. The people involved could not see the danger. They could not smell it. They could not escape something they did not yet understand. In the afternoon, the guide led the group to a hill overlooking part of the reactor complex. From there they could see the immense industrial structures rising above the landscape. The guide spoke about the sacrifices made during the weeks and months following the accident. Thousands of workers, soldiers, engineers, miners, pilots, and volunteers participated in emergency operations. Many accepted significant risks to prevent further catastrophe. Their efforts helped contain contamination, construct protective structures, and stabilize the damaged reactor. Brad sat quietly on a concrete barrier while listening. The stories were overwhelming. Human beings had made mistakes that contributed to the disaster, yet other human beings had displayed extraordinary courage in response. The contrast fascinated him. History often focused on failure, but here he could also see resilience. As sunset approached, golden light spread across the horizon. The reactor complex appeared almost peaceful from a distance. Brad knew that appearance was deceptive. Beneath the calm landscape lay memories of panic, suffering, and sacrifice. Before leaving, he looked once more toward the plant. For the first time since arriving in Chernobyl, he felt something stronger than curiosity. He felt gratitude. Gratitude toward people he had never met. People who had faced unimaginable circumstances and acted anyway. Their names might never become famous around the world, but without them the consequences of the disaster could have been far worse. That evening, back at the lodging facility, Brad sat alone by a window overlooking the dark forest. The trees swayed gently beneath the moonlight. Somewhere beyond them stood the silent city of Pripyat and the shattered reactor. Yet tonight his thoughts remained with the individuals who had run toward danger while everyone else fled. The heroes of those first hours had left behind more than history. They had left behind a lesson about courage that still echoed through the exclusion zone decades later. The following morning began beneath a sky the color of steel. A fine mist drifted through the trees as Brad joined the group for another day inside the exclusion zone. Although he had already seen abandoned neighborhoods, memorials, and the reactor itself, he sensed that the most difficult stories still remained untold. Today's destination was connected to the invisible enemy that had haunted every aspect of the disaster: radiation. The vehicle traveled through quiet roads lined with dense forest before arriving near a cluster of abandoned buildings. Time had transformed the area into a strange fusion of nature and ruin. Trees emerged from rooftops. Moss-covered walls. Broken windows reflected pale daylight. The guide explained that they were approaching one of the medical facilities involved in the early response to the accident. Brad felt a knot forming in his stomach. Unlike the reactor, which represented the cause of the disaster, places like this represented its human consequences. They entered a deteriorating building whose hallways were littered with debris. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips. Rust stained the ceilings. Every room seemed suspended between collapse and survival. Brad walked carefully through a corridor that once echoed with doctors' voices and hurried footsteps. Now only silence remained. The guide described the confusion that overwhelmed hospitals during the first days after the explosion. Patients arrived suffering from symptoms few medical professionals had ever encountered. Some responders initially appeared healthy despite receiving dangerous radiation doses. Others deteriorated rapidly. Physicians struggled to understand what they were facing. Treatments available at the time were limited. Information was incomplete. Fear spread almost as quickly as the contamination itself. Brad stepped into what had once been a patient ward. Rows of rusted bed frames stood beneath shattered windows. Rainwater had stained the floor. For a moment he imagined the room filled with exhausted firefighters and plant workers. Men who had spent the night battling flames, carrying equipment, and trying to prevent a greater catastrophe. Many had entered the reactor area believing they were fighting an ordinary fire. They had no idea that an invisible threat surrounded them. The guide paused beside one bed frame and shared a survivor's account. A young firefighter recalled severe fatigue and nausea developing shortly after his shift. By the following day, many of his colleagues could barely stand. Some suffered burns unlike any they had seen before. Others experienced symptoms that doctors initially struggled to explain. Brad listened in silence. The story felt more powerful here than it would have in any documentary. Standing inside the actual building created an uncomfortable intimacy with the past. Every hallway seemed to remember. Every room appeared to hold fragments of conversations long vanished. Later they moved to another section of the facility where old medical equipment remained scattered across the floor. Dust coated everything. Cabinets hung open. Papers lay crumpled beneath fallen ceiling panels. Nature had begun reclaiming the structure, yet traces of human effort remained visible everywhere. Brad found himself staring at an overturned wheelchair near a doorway. It was an ordinary object, yet it somehow symbolized the chaos of those days. People had rushed through these corridors attempting to save lives. They had worked with limited knowledge against an enemy they could neither see nor touch. During a break outside, the guide explained the broader effects of radioactive contamination. Vast areas had been evacuated. Thousands of families lost their homes. Entire communities disappeared almost overnight. Scientists continued studying the environmental and health consequences decades later. Brad gazed into the surrounding forest while listening. Birds moved among the branches. Insects buzzed through the grass. The landscape appeared healthy and alive. Yet hidden within the soil and vegetation remained traces of the disaster. Radiation was unlike any threat most people could imagine. It left no obvious mark. It often revealed itself only through consequences. In the afternoon the group visited a small memorial dedicated to medical workers. The monument was simple compared to others Brad had seen. Nevertheless, he found it deeply moving. Doctors, nurses, and support staff had faced overwhelming circumstances during the crisis. Many worked tirelessly despite uncertainty and fear. Their contributions often received less attention than those of firefighters and plant workers, yet they had carried enormous responsibility. Brad stood before the memorial for several minutes without speaking. The names engraved there reminded him that disasters are rarely endured by a single group. They ripple outward, affecting countless individuals in different ways. As evening approached, the mist returned. The forest seemed darker than usual. During the drive back, Brad watched the trees slide past the window and reflected on everything he had learned. The reactor had caused the disaster. The firefighters had confronted the flames. The workers had stabilized the plant. The medical teams had fought desperately to save the injured. Every layer of the story revealed new acts of courage and sacrifice. Yet another chapter still remained. Tomorrow he would explore one of the strangest aspects of Chernobyl's history, the people who eventually returned to live within the forbidden zone, choosing to remain in the shadow of the disaster rather than abandon the homes they loved. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving the forests of the exclusion zone covered in droplets that sparkled beneath the morning sun. Brad stood outside the lodging facility and breathed in the cool air. After days spent learning about destruction, sacrifice, and loss, he expected another journey into abandoned ruins. Instead, the guide announced that they would be visiting one of the most unusual parts of Chernobyl's story, the self-settlers. These were people who had returned to the exclusion zone despite government restrictions, choosing to live in their former homes rather than begin new lives elsewhere. Brad had read brief articles about them, but he knew very little beyond the basic facts. The vehicle left the main road and followed a narrow path through thick woodland. Branches brushed against the windows as they traveled deeper into an area rarely visited by tourists. Eventually the forest opened onto a tiny village. Several houses stood among gardens and fruit trees. Many structures were old and weathered, yet unlike the ruins of Pripyat, these homes showed signs of life. Smoke drifted from a chimney. Fresh footprints crossed a dirt path. A barking dog announced their arrival. The scene felt almost surreal. After days surrounded by abandonment, the presence of ordinary life seemed unexpected. The group was greeted by an elderly woman who lived alone in a small wooden house. Through a translator, she welcomed the visitors and invited them into her garden. Brad followed quietly. Rows of vegetables grew beside the house. Chickens wandered freely through the yard. Everything appeared peaceful. The woman explained that she had been evacuated in 1986 along with thousands of others. Officials told residents they would return within a few days. Weeks became months. Months became years. Eventually she decided she could not remain away any longer. Despite warnings and restrictions, she returned to her village and rebuilt her life there. Brad listened carefully as she spoke. Her voice carried neither anger nor regret. Instead, it reflected a deep attachment to the land. She pointed toward the surrounding fields and forests. Through the translator she explained that every tree held a memory. Every path reminded her of family members, neighbors, and childhood experiences. Leaving had felt like losing part of herself. Returning gave her a sense of peace, even if others considered the decision dangerous. Brad looked around the property. The garden was flourishing. Birds sang from nearby trees. Sunlight illuminated patches of wildflowers. It was difficult to reconcile this tranquil scene with the global image of Chernobyl as a poisoned wasteland. Yet the guide reminded everyone that radiation levels varied significantly throughout the zone. Some locations remained highly contaminated while others posed relatively low risks. The situation was complex, far more nuanced than many people realized. After thanking the woman for her hospitality, the group continued through the village. Several other residents still lived there, most of them elderly. Their numbers had declined over the years, but a small community remained. Brad spoke briefly with an old man who spent much of his time tending beehives. The man described the silence of the forests, the changing seasons, and the comfort of familiar surroundings. He acknowledged the risks but insisted that life away from home had felt unbearable. For him, returning had been worth the uncertainty. As the day progressed, Brad became fascinated by the resilience of these individuals. They had experienced evacuation, displacement, and decades of change. Yet many still chose connection over convenience. Their decision was not based on scientific calculations or political arguments. It was rooted in belonging. Home, they believed, was more than a location. It was part of identity. In the afternoon, the guide led the group through a nearby cemetery. Weathered gravestones stood among tall grass and wildflowers. Many belonged to generations who had lived in the region long before the nuclear plant existed. Brad noticed fresh flowers on several graves. Someone was still caring for them. The sight struck him deeply. Even after catastrophe, people continued maintaining ties to family, memory, and tradition. Human attachment proved remarkably difficult to erase. Before leaving the village, Brad turned for one last look at the houses. Smoke still drifted from chimneys. Chickens pecked at the ground. The elderly residents moved slowly through their daily routines. It was an ordinary scene in an extraordinary place. The exclusion zone often appeared in popular imagination as a realm of emptiness. Yet here life persisted in quiet, stubborn ways. During the drive back, the forest seemed different to Brad. Earlier in the journey he had viewed Chernobyl primarily as a monument to disaster. Now he saw another dimension. It was also a place where people continued seeking meaning, comfort, and connection despite everything that had happened. As evening settled across the landscape, he realized that the story of Chernobyl was not solely about what had been lost. It was also about what endured. Tomorrow he would encounter another side of that endurance when he explored the wildlife that had reclaimed much of the abandoned territory, transforming the exclusion zone into one of the most unusual ecosystems in Europe. The sun rose over the exclusion zone beneath a sky so clear that Brad could see endless layers of forest stretching toward the horizon. The previous day had challenged many of his assumptions about Chernobyl. He had expected abandonment and ruin, yet he had found gardens, homes, and people determined to remain connected to the land. Today promised another surprise. The guide explained that they would spend most of the day exploring areas known for their wildlife. Over the decades following the evacuation, large sections of the exclusion zone had transformed into an accidental sanctuary where nature flourished with minimal human interference. Brad found the idea fascinating. Few places on Earth offered such an unusual experiment. The vehicle left the paved road and traveled along rough tracks that cut through dense woodland. Trees formed a green tunnel overhead. Sunlight flickered across the windshield as branches swayed in the breeze. The deeper they traveled, the more isolated the landscape became. There were no towns. No traffic. No signs of modern life. Only forest. After nearly an hour, the group stopped near a wide meadow surrounded by trees. Everyone stepped out quietly. The guide motioned for silence and pointed toward the distant edge of the clearing. Brad followed the direction of his finger and immediately spotted movement. A herd of deer emerged from the forest and began grazing among the tall grass. Their movements were calm and unhurried. Several raised their heads briefly before returning to feed. The guide explained that populations of many species had increased significantly since humans left the area. Without agriculture, highways, urban expansion, and constant disturbance, wildlife gained access to vast stretches of habitat. Brad watched the animals for several minutes. The scene felt almost unreal considering where he was standing. The world associated Chernobyl with catastrophe, yet life surrounded him in every direction. As the morning continued, they encountered evidence of many other species. Tracks crossed muddy trails. Birds filled the air with calls and songs. The guide described sightings of wolves, lynxes, wild boars, elk, and even rare species that had become increasingly difficult to find elsewhere in Europe. Brad learned that scientists from numerous countries studied the region to better understand how ecosystems respond to extreme events and reduced human presence. Their findings often revealed a complicated picture. Radiation still affected parts of the environment, yet nature demonstrated remarkable resilience. Around midday the group climbed a wooden observation tower overlooking wetlands and forest. From the top, Brad could see kilometers of untouched landscape. Rivers wound through the trees like silver ribbons. Meadows stretched across open areas. The absence of human development was striking. Looking across the horizon, he realized that much of the region appeared similar to how it might have looked centuries earlier. The guide handed around binoculars. Brad scanned the distant tree line and suddenly spotted a large animal moving through the vegetation. For several moments he could not identify it. Then the guide confirmed what he was seeing. A European bison. Brad stared in amazement. The massive creature moved slowly among the trees before disappearing into the forest. The brief encounter left a lasting impression. It symbolized the unexpected transformation that had occurred here. In a place defined by one of history's greatest technological disasters. Some of Europe's most iconic wildlife had found refuge. During lunch beside a quiet river, Brad asked the guide whether nature had truly recovered. The answer was more complicated than a simple yes or no. Certain species and ecosystems showed remarkable success. Other areas still displayed measurable impacts from contamination. Scientists continued debating the long-term consequences. The guide emphasized that nature's recovery did not erase the suffering experienced by people. Rather, it revealed the extraordinary adaptability of life itself. Brad appreciated the distinction. Too often, discussions about Chernobyl focused on extremes. Some portrayed it as a dead wasteland. Others described it as a perfect environmental success story. Reality existed somewhere in between. The landscape carried scars, yet it also carried evidence of renewal. Later in the afternoon, the group explored a forest path near an abandoned village. Trees grew through the remains of houses. Roofs had collapsed beneath decades of weather. Yet everywhere Brad looked, plants and animals occupied the spaces humans had left behind. A fox darted across a clearing before vanishing among the ruins. Birds nested inside empty structures. Vines climbed walls that once sheltered families. Nature had not merely returned. It had integrated the remnants of human civilization into a new ecosystem. As sunset approached, golden light filtered through the forest canopy. Brad paused beside the remains of a house nearly hidden by vegetation. Only fragments of walls remained visible. The rest had disappeared beneath trees and shrubs. He imagined the family that once lived there. Their departure had marked the end of one story. Yet another story began almost immediately as the forest reclaimed the land. Life, he realized, rarely remains still. It adapts. It changes. It finds ways to continue. During the drive back, the sky burned orange and red above the treetops. Brad reflected on everything he had seen. The wildlife of Chernobyl did not erase the disaster. It did not undo the suffering or restore the lost communities. But it offered a reminder that even in places touched by tragedy, life possesses an extraordinary capacity for persistence. The lesson stayed with him long after darkness settled over the exclusion zone. Tomorrow, he would travel to one of the most secretive and mysterious structures hidden within the forests, a colossal relic of the Cold War that stood silently watching over the abandoned landscape like a monument from another world. The next morning began with an unusual sense of anticipation. During breakfast, the guide revealed that the group would visit one of the most mysterious structures inside the exclusion zone. Unlike the reactor, Pripyat, or the abandoned villages, this location had remained secret for much of its existence. Hidden deep within the forest stood an enormous military installation built during the Cold War. Known today as Duga, it was once part of a vast Soviet early warning system designed to detect incoming nuclear missiles. Brad had seen photographs before, but everyone who visited described the same experience. No image could prepare a person for its true scale. Shortly after sunrise, the vehicle left the main roads and traveled through increasingly dense woodland. The forest seemed endless. Tall pines stretched toward the sky while thick undergrowth crowded the edges of the track. For nearly an hour, nothing interrupted the landscape. Then, without warning, a dark shape appeared above the trees. At first Brad thought it was a distant industrial structure. As they moved closer, the shape continued growing larger. Steel beams emerged from the horizon like the skeleton of some impossible machine. Within minutes the entire structure dominated the view. Brad stared through the window in disbelief. Duga rose above the forest like a metallic mountain. Towering rows of antennas stretched hundreds of meters across the landscape. Even after reading the dimensions, Brad struggled to comprehend them. The structure seemed less like a piece of equipment and more like a man-made cliff constructed from steel. The vehicle stopped near the base of the installation. Everyone stepped outside and instinctively looked upward. The antenna framework climbed into the sky. Wind passed through the metal lattice, producing faint sounds that echoed across the clearing. Brad felt very small standing beneath it. The guide explained that Duga had been built during one of the most tense periods of the Cold War. Its purpose was to detect missile launches from great distances, providing precious minutes of warning in the event of nuclear attack. The system represented both technological ambition and political fear. Billions of people had lived under the shadow of potential nuclear conflict. Structures like Duga existed because entire nations prepared for scenarios they hoped would never occur. Brad walked slowly along the base of the antenna. Rust covered many surfaces. Trees pushed through cracks in nearby concrete. Yet despite decades of abandonment, the installation remained astonishingly imposing. Every beam and platform reflected an era obsessed with secrecy, surveillance, and survival. The guide described how radio enthusiasts around the world once detected unusual signals generated by the system. The repetitive transmissions earned it a famous nickname, the Russian woodpecker. For years, few people outside military circles understood the source of the mysterious sound. Brad imagined operators working inside nearby control buildings, monitoring equipment and analyzing data while remaining largely invisible to the outside world. They entered one of the abandoned support structures. Dust-covered floors and machinery. Faded signs still hung on walls. Long corridors disappeared into darkness. Some rooms contained remnants of equipment while others stood completely empty. Brad noticed old control panels filled with switches and dials. The technology looked ancient compared to modern systems, yet it had once represented cutting-edge engineering. Every room felt frozen in time. The Soviet Union itself no longer existed, but traces of its ambitions remained here. As the group continued exploring, the guide discussed the strange relationship between Duga and Chernobyl. The military complex had operated near the nuclear plant because of logistical advantages and regional infrastructure. When the disaster occurred, the surrounding area was evacuated, and the future of the installation became uncertain. Eventually it too was abandoned. One historic event had effectively swallowed another. The nuclear accident transformed not only civilian communities but also secret military projects hidden within the forests. During the afternoon, Brad climbed partway up an access stairway that offered a view across the surrounding landscape. From that height, he could see forests stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond the trees lay Pripyat, the reactor, and countless abandoned villages. The view carried a strange symbolism. Duga represented one form of human fear, the fear of war. Chernobyl represented another, the consequences of technological failure. Both emerged from an age defined by immense power and immense uncertainty. Standing there, Brad felt as though he was looking at the remains of an entire era rather than a single structure. As sunset approached, golden light illuminated the steel framework. Shadows stretched across the forest floor. The gigantic antenna appeared almost beautiful against the evening sky. Yet beneath that beauty lingered memories of tension, secrecy, and geopolitical rivalry. Brad remained silent during the drive back. His thoughts drifted between the reactor and Duga. Both were monuments to humanity's desire for control. Both revealed how fragile that control could become. One had been built to watch for catastrophe. The other had become catastrophe. By the time darkness settled over the exclusion zone, Brad realized his journey was entering its final stages. Tomorrow he would return to Pripyat one last time, not as a tourist searching for history, but as a witness trying to understand what the city still had to teach those willing to listen. Brad awoke before sunrise on what would be his final full day inside the exclusion zone. Through the window of his room, he could see a thin layer of fog drifting between the trees. The forest appeared almost dreamlike beneath the pale morning light. During the past week he had walked through abandoned cities, stood beside the reactor, listened to stories of heroism, met people who had returned to their homes, and explored forgotten relics of the Cold War. Yet something continued drawing him back to Pripyat. The city seemed to occupy a unique place in his thoughts. It was more than an abandoned location. It felt like the emotional center of everything he had experienced. When the guide announced that they would spend the day there, Brad felt both excitement and unease. The vehicle entered the city shortly after dawn. The streets were nearly invisible beneath vegetation. Trees lined roads that once carried thousands of residents to work and school. Apartment buildings rose from the greenery like islands emerging from a sea of leaves. The city seemed quieter than Brad remembered. Perhaps it was the early hour. Perhaps it was because he now understood far more about the lives that had once filled these streets. The guide encouraged everyone to explore slowly and observe details they might have overlooked during previous visits. Brad wandered away from the group and followed a narrow path between apartment blocks. Every step revealed small traces of the past. A rusted bicycle frame lay half-buried beneath shrubs. A faded street sign remained attached to a crumbling wall. Fragments of broken glass sparkled in the sunlight. None of these objects were remarkable by themselves, yet together they formed a portrait of a city interrupted in mid-sentence. Brad eventually reached a school building he had not visited before. The entrance doors hung open. Vines crawled across the facade. Inside, silence filled every corridor. He walked carefully through classrooms where desks remained scattered across the floor. Maps peeled from walls. Books rested beneath layers of dust. Nature had entered through shattered windows, allowing plants to grow where students once studied mathematics, literature, and science. Brad paused inside one classroom and imagined the final lessons taught there. Teachers could not have known they were addressing students for the last time in that building. Children could not have known that ordinary routines were about to disappear forever. The thought lingered as he continued exploring. Further down the corridor he discovered a room filled with old musical instruments. Most were damaged beyond repair. Dust covered every surface. Yet a piano remained standing against one wall. Several keys were missing. Others appeared cracked and warped. Brad gently touched one of the remaining keys. A faint note echoed through the empty room before fading into silence. The sound lasted only a moment, but it felt strangely powerful. For decades the building had stood abandoned. Yet for an instant, it had spoken again. Outside, the fog had disappeared. Warm sunlight illuminated the city. Brad made his way toward a residential district where several apartment towers overlooked a large square. From an upper-floor balcony, he gazed across Pripyat. Trees filled courtyards once occupied by playgrounds. Forests stretched between buildings. The city looked less like an urban environment and more like an ancient ruin slowly being absorbed by nature. Yet unlike ancient ruins, its history remained recent enough that survivors still remembered every street, every store, every apartment. That closeness made the silence more profound. During the afternoon, the group visited a small overlook near the edge of the city. The guide shared photographs taken before the disaster. Families smiled from balconies. Children played in parks. Crowds gathered during celebrations. Brad compared the photographs to the landscape before him. The contrast was heartbreaking. Yet it also revealed something important. The true tragedy of Pripyat was not the abandoned buildings. It was the lives displaced from them. The city mattered because people had once loved it. Without those memories, the ruins would be little more than concrete and steel. As evening approached, Brad returned alone to the amusement park. The Ferris wheel stood exactly as he remembered it. Motionless. Silent. Eternal. Golden sunlight reflected from the rusted metal. Leaves rustled in the breeze. For several minutes he simply stood there, observing the landmark that had become a symbol recognized around the world. Then he closed his eyes and imagined the city as it had once been. He pictured music playing through loudspeakers. Children laughing. Vendors preparing snacks. Families gathering for a day of celebration. The image felt vivid enough to be real. When he opened his eyes, the vision disappeared. Only the abandoned park remained. Yet the exercise changed something within him. He no longer saw Pripyat merely as a ghost town. He saw it as a place filled with invisible stories. The buildings were empty, but the memories remained. As the sun sank below the horizon, long shadows stretched across the amusement park. Brad realized that tomorrow he would leave Chernobyl. The journey that had begun with curiosity was ending with understanding. Yet one final lesson still awaited him. Before returning home, he would face the question that every visitor eventually confronted. What should humanity learn from a place like this, and what responsibility came with remembering it? Brad's final morning inside the exclusion zone arrived quietly. The forest outside his window stood motionless beneath a pale blue sky. For several minutes he remained seated on the edge of his bed, listening to the silence. It was a different silence than the one he had felt when he first arrived. Back then, it had seemed unsettling and mysterious. Now it felt thoughtful, almost reflective. During the past days he had walked through the ruins of Pripyat, stood before reactor number 4, listened to stories of firefighters and plant workers, met elderly residents who returned to their homes, and witnessed nature reclaiming abandoned land. Every experience had added another layer to his understanding. Chernobyl was no longer a distant historical event. It had become something personal. After breakfast, Brad asked permission to spend a few hours alone before departing. The guide agreed. Carrying only a notebook, he followed a quiet road leading toward a small clearing overlooking the forest. The morning air was cool and fresh. Birds moved through the trees. Sunlight filtered through the branches in shifting patterns. Nothing about the landscape suggested catastrophe. That contrast had fascinated him throughout the journey. The disaster remained one of the most significant technological failures in human history, yet the environment often appeared peaceful. It was a reminder that tragedy and beauty can exist side by side. Brad reached the clearing and sat on a fallen tree. For a long time he simply observed the surrounding landscape. He thought about the city of Pripyat and the families who had left their homes believing they would soon return. He thought about firefighters climbing onto reactor rooftops without understanding the danger they faced. He thought about doctors working through exhaustion, engineers struggling to contain the damage, and elderly villagers refusing to abandon the places they loved. Every story pointed toward a common truth. Chernobyl was never only about radiation or technology. It was about people. Human decisions had contributed to the accident. Human courage had limited its consequences. Human resilience had shaped everything that followed. As he reflected, Brad opened his notebook and began writing. At first he intended to record observations from the trip. Instead, he found himself writing questions. Why do societies forget important lessons? Why do people assume disasters belong only to the past? Why does technological progress sometimes create the illusion that mistakes are impossible? The questions filled several pages. Chernobyl, he realized, was not merely a warning about nuclear energy. It was a warning about complacency. Complex systems require honesty, responsibility, and transparency. When those qualities weaken, risks grow. The lesson applied far beyond a single reactor or a single country. Around midday, Brad returned to the vehicle that would take him out of the exclusion zone. As they drove through the forests, he looked out the window one final time. The landscape passed slowly. Villages hidden among trees. Empty roads. Fields reclaimed by nature. Every kilometer carried memories. Eventually they reached the checkpoint marking the boundary of the zone. Guards performed routine procedures while visitors waited nearby. Brad stepped out of the vehicle and turned toward the forest behind him. Somewhere beyond those trees stood the Ferris wheel of Pripyat. Beyond that stood the reactor. Beyond that lay countless stories of ordinary people whose lives had been altered forever. He knew he would never forget them. The barrier lifted, and the vehicle continued toward the outside world. Traffic gradually increased. Modern towns appeared. Billboards lined the roads. The rhythms of everyday life returned. Yet Brad felt different. Before arriving, he had viewed Chernobyl primarily through the lens of history. Now he understood that its significance extended into the present. The disaster continued teaching lessons to anyone willing to listen. It reminded humanity that knowledge must be paired with responsibility. That progress requires humility. That transparency matters. That courage often appears in ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Most importantly, it reminded him that behind every headline, statistic, and historical event are human lives. As evening approached, Brad's train departed for Kiev. Through the window, he watched the countryside roll past beneath a setting sun. The horizon glowed gold and orange. Villages, rivers, and forests slipped into darkness. Somewhere far behind him, the exclusion zone remained exactly as it had before his arrival. Silent. Mysterious. Unforgettable. Yet he realized that Chernobyl was not truly frozen in time. It continued evolving through memory, research, and reflection. Its story was still being written. The responsibility now belonged to those who remembered it. Brad closed his notebook and looked out at the fading light. The journey was over. The lesson was not. And as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, he understood why people traveled from around the world to visit that extraordinary place. They came seeking history. They left carrying something far more valuable. Perspective.